The first one's from Neil. He's got two questions, so this is the first one. Can you help point me in directions for a better understanding of certain laws in the Old Testament that can get a bit tricky to explain, especially for non-believers? One that is brought up is that raped women must marry their rapists.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, most of the Old Testament's laws reflect an ancient patriarchal culture. I mean, that's pretty obvious. The Old Testament law didn't drop out of heaven as some sort of unique morality system that was shared by no other culture, even though that tends to be the way that Christians think about the Old Testament law. But that is not the case. And it's easy to demonstrate that is not the case. All you have to do is look at, other ancient Near Eastern law codes, like Hammurabi is probably the one that people have heard of. But there are lots of other ancient law codes, some from Egypt, the Hittite laws, whatever. And Old Testament law will invariably have, some touch point with these other law codes. Now, some Old Testament laws are different. In other words, they're uniquely tied to Yahweh's special relationship with Israel, things like the Passover and the Sabbath and whatnot. But most civil regulations, most laws, civil law, rules for warfare, rules for marriage, that kind of thing. Most of those have clear parallels in other ancient Near Eastern cultures and their law codes. So part of the answer is to lose the conception that the Old Testament law dropped from heaven. Again, if that's what's in your head and you come across a question like this, from some Bible debunker or something like that, then you're going to be in trouble. So you need to get reconnected back to reality. And that is that Old Testament laws reflect an ancient patriarchal culture. And, this is no surprise to God. It shouldn't be any surprise to us because this is, these are the people that God chose and prompted to write the Bible. Now, for those who might be new to the podcast, one of the videos I did sort of for newbies, to sort of start here, it's on the website, if you're new, start here, is about how I approach Scripture. And I talk a little bit about this, that, again, there is no divinely inspired culture. God chose people to write Scripture that already had a culture. They lived at a specific time and a specific place. God knew what he was getting with the biblical writers, Moses or otherwise, and the culture in which they were raised, since he'd made the choice of using people from that specific time and place. So Israelite laws and life are not going to be alien to their own time and place. And again, these are God's choices. So when God chooses people at this time and place and culture, patriarchal context, again, he knows what he's getting. He also doesn't endorse that particular culture as being the divine culture. You say, well, Mike, how can you say that? It's the Mosaic law. Well, yeah, again, you have to dispense with this flawed notion that the Old Testament law drops from heaven. It's not difficult to make that statement because if you look at the salvation plan of the Bible as a whole, in other words, you take your head out of the Mosaic law, out of the Pentateuch, it's quite apparent that the Old Testament system, the theocratic system, and the laws that go with it were planned to become obsolete. Okay, there was going to be this person called the Messiah, the son of David. What that person does is going to include the Gentile, the icky nations, the disinherited nations of the ancient world. Even in the Old Testament covenants, the nations aren't entirely dispensed with. I've talked about this many times on the podcast, especially in my book, The Unseen Realm. The theocratic system and the ancient patriarchal culture system that went with it were designed to become obsolete. That alone should tell you that God doesn't endorse a particular culture. Because he planned for it to go away. As soon as Israel goes into the land, part of what they're doing as far as their civil laws and their way of life is automatically going to change. This is why you have differences in laws between Exodus and Deuteronomy. The setting of Exodus is they're wandering around the desert. They're nomadic in their lifestyle. They're not urban. The situation in Deuteronomy plans for urban life, life in cities in a particular land. This is why, again, a lot of the laws are different at points because they adapt to a different context. They change. And so, again, this is sort of built into the system. And ultimately, when you take the big picture look, the system was designed to become obsolete. So there is no one divinely inspired culture. I mean, there is divinely inspired morality, but how a culture reflects that morality, again, it is an open question. Israelites could, demonstrate their fidelity, to their spouse and their children in, somewhat different ways than some other culture would do that. Okay, everybody knows what adultery is, and they're going to avoid that and all that kind of stuff. But there are, again, relationships that are talked about in civil legislation in the Mosaic Law that may not get talked about the same way in a different culture, but the principle is the same, and that's okay. Again, the Gentiles were supposed to be part of this from the beginning. They're put into the plan. It's designed to become obsolete. There is no one inspired culture. We're not supposed to go back to the Mosaic period and sort of go back to the Stone Age here. Again, there's nothing like that in Scripture. So we need to think a little more clearly. Now, beyond that, I'd actually need to know what law the questioner is talking about. And the question is a little bit vague. I'm going to make an assumption here in the next minute or so about what the person's thinking. But the penalty for rape in the Old Testament is pretty clear. It was the death penalty, not marriage. Now, Neil, I think was the questioner's name, might be talking about some of the laws in Deuteronomy 22. Okay, that's my guess, in which case it isn't saying a woman was forced to marry her rapist. That's a bit of a simplistic reading, but let's go look at Deuteronomy 22, and I'll read it. We'll just pick up here in verse 23. These are various laws, again, in Deuteronomy, this section of Deuteronomy. But we get to Deuteronomy 22, verse 23, and I'm going to be reading ultimately through verse 29. It says this, verse 23, "If there is a betrothed virgin, and a man greets her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. The young woman, why? Because she did not cry for help, though she was in the city, and the man, because he violated his neighbor's wife. So you shall purge the evil from your midst." Now notice, this is kind of interesting, betrothal, the verse 23 begins with betrothed virgin, is actually equated with marriage, neighbor's wife, in verse 24. So here you have a situation that involves a woman, again, who, is betrothed, and in that culture, basically that amounts to marriage. They're both put to death. So the woman willingly violates her betrothal, violates her marriage, quote, "She did not cry for help." And a man who either knowingly seduces a woman who's already betrothed or married, or seduces a woman he thinks is not married or betrothed, whatever, he forces himself upon her. So this is why they're both put to death, even though you have the man doing something, forcible. And probably, I think, we aren't really told what the man knows. We are told that the woman is married or betrothed and whatnot. So when she doesn't cry out, she's complicit in what's going on. I would say, though, that it's probably more likely that the man knowingly seduced someone who was married, that he had that information. There was some way he could tell, because he winds up being punished with death, whereas the case of a man that seduces a woman who clearly isn't betrothed or married, we're going to read about that later on in a few verses, you don't get the death penalty in that situation. So probably what's going on here is you have a woman who willingly violates her marriage, and a man who willingly seduces or forces himself upon someone who's already married, and he knows it. So when it's discovered, they're both put to death. Now, one of the reasons why this crime and others that involved adultery was punishable by death is cultural. Again, we're back here to the patriarchal culture and sort of their life setting. So very clearly, in this case, you don't have, you two guys got to get married now because the one was already married. So we don't have that. But we do have the death penalty. And that's because in their context, in their culture, women and children were utterly, and I mean totally, dependent economically. I mean, really, it's a matter of life and death. Do we have anything to eat or not upon men? They're totally dependent economically on men. So when a man committed adultery, he, in theory, might literally be abandoning one wife, or, a wife, and the children that he already had. And if he does that to go off with another woman, he basically leaves them destitute. He leaves them in a situation where their lives are threatened. Really, truly. And so that was viewed as something that was a crime that put someone's life in jeopardy. And in the Old Testament, just generally speaking, these are the kinds of crimes when someone else's life is put in jeopardy or taken, they result in the death penalty for that reason. Again, if you put someone in this kind of situation deliberately, you're going to forfeit your life. You have forfeited your life to live because you put their life in jeopardy or, again, actually taken it. So that's one issue. You have, sort of another layered issue here. Adulterous relationships in this time period confused inheritance rights. And again, that could result in people losing literally their livelihood. So men and women could be equally guilty, putting other people at risk in this way. When you have people who are living in a subsistence lifestyle situation, when one person, man or woman, decides to forsake their marital relationship and go off to another, if it's the woman, then the second man sort of gets invited into the situation, and he can lay claim to the first man, the husband, the first man's inheritance, his property, his livelihood. Then he could kick out the kids that aren't his, and they're destitute. So you have all these kind of situations, either a man willingly doing this or a man being brought into the picture. The victims here, again, women and children, could in theory be left utterly destitute. And that is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why this crime, adultery, was looked upon so severely. It wasn't just about the sex act. It was about dependence and inheritance and day-to-day means of staying alive. So again, it sounds severe to our ear, and of course it is, but again, the theocratic system and the patriarchal culture that was tied to it, because God revealed himself to these people at this time in this place who were living in this culture, all that stuff that was tied together was planned to be obsolete. Okay, from the very beginning. This is what salvation history shows us. So we're not obligated to go back to this system. It just is what it is. And again, it's a reflection of the culture, the severity, again, of some of these things. Because when you put someone's life at risk, when you threaten them with bodily harm, that was viewed as an extreme act. And frankly, because people were viewed as imagers of God, God's image, it was like doing that to God in effigy. Again, committing some violent act or some act that put that person's very life at risk. That's why it was viewed so severely. Now let's go back to the passage. So the first case is, again, you got a willing woman committing adultery with a willing man. Then you go to verse 25. But here's a second scenario. If in the open country, okay, we're not in a city anymore, but if in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, so the woman is still betrothed here, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman. She has committed no offense punishable by death. For this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor. I mean, look, it's linked there to murder because, again, this is violence against someone's, bodily well-being, a physical violent act. Verse 27, for this case is like the man attacking and murdering his neighbor because he met her in the open country, and though the betrothed woman cried for help, there was no one to rescue her. So this case is viewed differently than the first one, really because of where it happens, the open country. The betrothed woman is given the benefit of the doubt. The law assumes that she cried out. In other words, it assumes that she was raped. It assumes that she wasn't willing, whereas in the first scenario, she didn't cry out. But since she's in the open country, nobody could hear her and come to her aid because they weren't in a city or town. So here we clearly have rape. And again, look at the situation. There's no forced marriage, all right? Only the man is put to death. The key element is that the woman was betrothed, or by implication, again, back to the first case, she was looked upon as belonging to her husband, to this man that she was betrothed to. It's assumed that since she was the unwilling victim of a crime, her spouse would still have her, after the fact, meaning her livelihood is still intact. Okay, so she and her children, if she already had some, won't be, destitute. Again, it's not. The assumption is, again, that the man who does this, again, he's the only one that's going to get the death penalty because of the violence of the act. And she, again, by implication, there's nothing really said about her, about the situation she's in. So, most scholars would assume that her spouse would take her back and she'd be okay, even though she's been shamed, in this way. Now, the next case is probably the one that the questioner is thinking of. And the question is this rape or not? And frankly, it could go either way. So here's verse 28. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed, okay, so that's a different scenario, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, again, there's no reference about crying out or not crying out or anything like this. Then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all his days. Now, this case law could be read in two ways. One, on one hand, it could be read as a rape of an unbetrothed woman. In other words, there was no marriage violated here. the language can work. Again, the language, the notion of rape can work, and the language can support it, but it isn't actually conclusive, as we'll see in a little bit. The ambiguity is probably due to the elements in the parallel law. There's a parallel to this in Exodus 22, 16 and 17, where very specifically seduction is mentioned, and the woman's father can refuse his daughter to the offending man. Now here's Exodus 22:16. If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. So I think the law in Deuteronomy needs to be interpreted in light of the more detailed, or these other details in the Exodus 22 parallel. But eliminating the parallel, which is what most Bible debunkers will naturally do, does make it sound more like rape than anything else, than any other possibility. But again, I'm not going to exclude the parallel. I think they need to be interpreted in tandem. So let's talk about that. In Exodus 22, 16 and 17, the woman's fate, you'll recall from having just read it, actually depends on the disposition of her father. Did he think his daughter was raped, she's wronged, or that she consented? In either case, she has been sexually violated or deflowered, or however you want to put that, and in their culture is basically unmarriable after that point. Now, it's not an impossibility that a man would still, marry her, but it's very unlikely. If the father believes his daughter was wronged, he can refuse to give her to the man. There's no death penalty because the woman is not at risk of destitution. It's assumed, again, her father would take care of her. But the offender must pay compensation to the father, the bride price, again, because the father's likely to never get the bride price for his daughter in a normal marriage, a dowry. I would add that the law is actually designed to deter rape, if you think about it, not to make it attractive. What man would want to be forced to live with a woman who would hate him the rest of her life, and so on and so forth, not to mention her family. They would also hate him. So you have this odd situation where, depending on what the father thinks, the father makes the decision about, okay, you two have to get married now, or no, you wronged my daughter and she's going to stay with me, and now you have to pay the bride price. Now, on the other hand, if the father is inclined, again, because he didn't view the situation as rape, again, we have to assume that, he can part ways with his daughter, who shamed him, and the family because she willingly had sex before betrothal or marriage. So in that case, the deed is still viewed as wrong. The couple, what they did was wrong, but now the couple must get married and can't divorce. So the consenting couple, again, this is viewing the passage, the situation, not as a rape, but as, again, a premarital sexual situation. In this case, if this is what the father sort of decides, then the consenting couple is stuck with each other. Since they both knew the law, they both knew what the outcome could be, they shouldn't have done it. And the offender, the man, still has to pay the bride price to the father because now it's treated as a marriage. So essentially the first view is, look, you shouldn't have done this. You forced my daughter. Again, we don't have a death penalty situation because she wasn't already married and she's not going to be destitute. I'm going to take care of her, but buddy, there's no way you're getting her. Pay up the bride price because now she'll never be able to get married normally. So that's scenario one. Scenario two is, okay, you two wanted to do this and now you're stuck. Okay. And you can't ever get divorced. And I expect the bride price now, like this would be a normal marriage. So there's actually two ways you could read the passage. Now the system, we can look at it and I think it's honest. The system isn't perfect. No legal system is because of the nature of people. An unhappy, offending man might be abusive to the woman he's forced to marry. Okay, that could happen. But no law presumes omniscience of all situations. The Bible has laws to protect people or to promote people to treat each other well, but do they always do that? No. Okay. People still harm each other. Wives are under the protection of laws punishing violence, but that doesn't mean violence never happens to them. In other words, the law, even biblical law, didn't stop evil. Biblical law is typically about crime and punishment, that kind of thing. What you're supposed to do and not supposed to do, and then what happens if you disobey or you're guilty of neglect or something like that. Again, the system isn't perfect. Just because it's the Mosaic law doesn't mean that it nullified the evil in people's hearts and that, crimes weren't committed. That's absurd. So yeah, the system is not perfect. You could have a situation where the offender might be abusive to the woman, but again, they weren't supposed to do that either. There's no biblical law that allows domestic violence. On the contrary, even though biblical laws often tend to use masculine language, things like if a man does this, then that happens. That doesn't mean that the laws also weren't for women. Okay, think about it. If these laws against doing violence to one another weren't about women as well, then that means that there are no laws in the Mosaic Law that pertain to women. Women can do what they want. It's absurd. It's just an absurdity. Even killing a female slave was a serious crime in biblical law. Okay, Exodus 21:20. Domestic violence was not okay in Israel, even within a patriarchal system. And you say, well, were they really looking out for that? Were they really as sensitive as we are to that? Well, probably not. Okay, I think that's probably a reasonable given. But again, there's nothing in Mosaic law that endorses what can happen in a tough situation like this. So yeah, the system isn't perfect, but again, no system of law can be because of the condition of the human heart, and the laws don't assume omniscience. So I think, again, back to the original question, what you have here is you have a passage, if I'm guessing correctly, that it's this passage. You have a passage that, yeah, it could be read as a rape, but I think, it could also be read not as a rape. And if we bring Exodus 22 into the picture, then the situation is really at the disposition of the father. What does the father think happened and why? So the father has to make a decision about protecting his daughter, having her stay with him, or forcing these two to get married or whatever. And you say, well, that boy, he could make a mistake. That could be wrong. The poor woman. Yeah, you can say all those things. But again, no legal system is perfect. Okay, our legal system today, if we think of ourselves as more enlightened than these primitive biblical people, go ahead and think that. But is our system perfect? Get your head out of the sand. There's no way. It's not even close to being perfect. It is wide open for abuse, and people are very clever at how they abuse it. So again, the answer isn't laws, even biblical laws. The answer is a changed heart. That's really the bottom line. So he had another question?
He did. Neil's other question is, Mike, can you please shed some light on the Lord your God instead of the Lord our God in Deuteronomy 2:30? He knows Dr. Ron Johnson touched on this a bit with the Saul-David relationship, but this one seems a bit more out of place.
Deuteronomy 2:30. Let's see, which says, this is a reference to Sihon, the king of Heshbon, would not let us pass by him. But for the Lord your God hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate, that he might give him into your hand as he is this day. So this is Moses speaking to the Israelites. Honestly, I don't see a problem. Moses is addressing the people of Israel, and he refers to God as the Lord your God. Israelites, this is your God who's giving you Sihon, the king of Heshbon, into your hand. Well, of course Yahweh's their God. What other God would he mention? How else would he say it? I don't think we have Moses saying, well, Yahweh's your God, but I all of a sudden have a different God. But maybe I'm not getting the point of the question. I don't see a problem, so I don't really know what else to do with that.